The stars belonged to death now. Across the galaxy, worlds that once teemed with life lay silent and cold. The Kethvar hegemony moved through space like a plague, their massive hive ships blocking out suns as they stripped planets bare. They took everything: metals, water, atmosphere, and life itself. What they could not use, they destroyed. Commander Vexithul stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching another world die. Below them, the green and blue marble that had been home to the Zenthari people was turning gray. Giant harvesting machines worked across its surface, draining oceans and tearing apart forests. In 3 days, nothing would remain but rock and dust. The Zenthari had tried to fight. They had good ships and brave soldiers. It did not matter. The Kethvar had numbers that filled the void between stars. Their weapons turned matter into energy, and their shields could stop anything the galaxy's defenders threw at them. Most importantly, they felt no mercy, no doubt, no fear. How many escaped? Vexthul asked his subordinate. Perhaps 10,000 in scattered ships. They flee toward the outer rim. Send pursuit squadrons. Kill them all. This was how it always went. The Kethvar did not take prisoners or allow refugees. They had learned that survivors could rebuild, could warn others, could fight back. Better to end each species completely. Clean, final, efficient. The hegemony had been expanding for 300 years. They had destroyed the proud Altarian Republic, whose crystal cities had once reflected the light of 1,000 stars. They had consumed the Velkan Federation, whose great libraries held the wisdom of ages. They had hunted down the nomadic Rixtar fleets in the deep dark between galaxies. Hundreds of species, billions of worlds, all gone. Some governments tried diplomacy. The Kethvar listened politely, then opened fire. Some species offered surrender and slavery. The Kethvar accepted their surrender, worked them to death, then destroyed their worlds anyway. Some civilizations simply ran, fleeing to the unknown reaches of space. The galaxy had become a place of whispers and shadows. Trade routes lay empty. Communications networks went silent. Ancient species that had explored the stars for millennia now hid in asteroid belts and dead systems, praying not to be found, but in the outer rim, far from the great spiral arms where civilizations rose and fell. Some still survived. Kepler 442b was not an important world. It had no rare minerals, no strategic position, no great cities or mighty fleets. It was simply a quiet planet where crops grew well and people could live in peace. The star was stable, the gravity comfortable, and the air sweet. For 3 generations, 30,000 humans had called it home. Sarah Chen stood in her laboratory, studying samples from the local soil. She was a xenobiologist by training, though there was little call for such expertise on a farming world. Still, she enjoyed her work cataloging the native microorganisms and helping the colonists understand their new ecosystem. Her husband Marcus kept the settlement's fusion reactor running and trained young people in engineering. Their daughter Lily was 8 years old and had never known any world but this one. Life was simple on Kepler 442b. People grew food, fixed machines, taught children, and watched the stars. They traded stories around campfires and celebrated harvests together. They followed strict protocols about radio emissions and energy signatures. No one wanted to attract attention from the void. The colony had not started as a hiding place. When the first ships arrived 90 years ago, the Kethvar were still unknown. The colonists came seeking new opportunities, fresh land, and the freedom of frontier life. They built their settlement in a valley between gentle hills, near a river that ran clear and cold from mountain springs. Then the news reached them. Faster-than-light communications told horrible stories from the inner galaxy, species vanishing overnight, planets stripped clean, refugee fleets scattered and hunted down, the great civilizations falling one by one to an enemy that showed no interest in anything but destruction. The colonists made a hard choice. They went dark. No more radio transmissions to other worlds, no more supply ships from Earth, no more contact with the greater human sphere. They dismantled their orbital facilities and buried their landing strips. They became invisible. It was not easy. Some families chose to leave in the early years, taking their chances with refugee fleets heading toward unknown space. Others argued for stronger defenses, for joining the galactic resistance. But most agreed with the careful path. Hide, survive, wait for the storm to pass. Marcus Chen had been among those who wanted to fight. He remembered arguing with the colony council, insisting that hiding was just another form of death. But Sarah had been pregnant with Lily then. and the sight of refugee ships arriving with stories of genocide had changed his mind. Some things were worth preserving, even if it meant living in fear. Now Lily ran through the settlement's gardens, playing with her friends among the corn and tomatoes. She was fascinated by the small community of Altarian refugees who had found their way to Kepler 442b in the early dark years. The tall, graceful beings had adapted well to human society, contributing their knowledge of hydroponics and stellar navigation. Lily especially loved their stories of crystal cities and singing stones, though she could barely imagine such wonders. The Altarians had arrived 15 years ago, their ship damaged and their supplies nearly gone. Only 63 of them remained from a convoy of millions. They had watched their homeworld die from space, seen their children murdered by creatures that felt nothing. The humans of Kepler 442b had welcomed them without question, sharing food and shelter and friendship. Elder Zenthara often told Lily stories of the old days, when the galaxy was vast and full of wonders, ships that sailed between stars like ancient vessels on earthly seas, worlds where different species lived and worked together, markets where beings traded not just goods but ideas, art, and dreams. It seemed like fantasy to a child who had known only one small settlement on one quiet world. The colony's leaders met every month to discuss security, resources, and planning. They monitored comm frequencies for news from the outside, though such news was rare and usually bad. They maintained emergency protocols in case of discovery. They debated whether to send scouts to contact other hidden human settlements, but always decided the risk was too great. Director Hassan, the colony's elected leader, often reminded people that their safety depended on discipline. No unauthorized transmissions, no bright lights visible from orbit, no energy signatures that might attract attention. They had survived by being careful, and careful they would remain. The children born on Kepler 442b knew nothing of starships or galactic civilization. To them, the settlement was the whole world and the world was good. They learned farming and engineering, read books downloaded decades ago, and played games their grandparents had taught them. They were happy in ways that children in the great cities of the inner worlds had perhaps never been. Sometimes Sarah wondered if they were being selfish. While they lived in peace, other human worlds might be fighting for survival. Other colonies might need their help. But then she would see Lily laughing with her friends, human and Altarian children playing together in the sunshine, and she knew they had made the right choice. The harvest festivals were the best times. The whole community would gather to celebrate another year of survival, another season of plenty. They would sing old songs and tell old stories. The Altarians would demonstrate their light-weaving arts, creating beautiful patterns in the air that made the children gasp with wonder. Families would share food and drink and the simple joy of being alive. During the last festival, Elder Zenthara had told a story about the ancient days, when the galaxy was young and species met as friends rather than enemies. She spoke of great alliances built on trust, of explorers who mapped unknown stars together, of artists who created beauty that transcended species boundaries. Lily had listened with wide eyes, imagining a universe full of wonders. But those days were gone now, lost to the hunger of the hive. The galaxy belonged to death, and the living could only hide and hope. On Kepler 442b, 30,000 humans and 63 Altarians continued their quiet existence, growing their crops and raising their children and watching the stars for signs of danger. They did not know that their time was running out. They did not know that a HFY scout fleet was following the trail of ancient refugee ships, tracking energy signatures decades old. They did not know that their careful discipline would soon be tested in ways they had never imagined. Sarah Chen tucked her daughter into bed and kissed her goodnight, just as she had every night for 8 years. Tomorrow would bring new lessons, new games, new stories. Tomorrow the sun would rise over their peaceful valley, and life would continue as it always had. Tomorrow was the last day of their hidden world, in the depths of space. Engines burned with cold fire and death drew closer to paradise. The first sign of trouble came from the orbital sensor array that the colonists thought they had dismantled completely. Marcus. Chen was repairing a water pump when his emergency communicator buzzed with an incoming signal. The device was old, barely functional, and supposed to stay silent except in the most extreme circumstances. His hand shook as he activated it. Marcus, get to the command center now. Director Hassan's voice carried barely controlled panic. We have a situation. The command center was hidden beneath the community hall, accessible through a concealed entrance behind the grain storage. Marcus had helped build it 20 years ago, hoping it would never be needed. Now he found himself running down narrow corridors, lined with emergency supplies and communication equipment that had waited decades for activation. Hassan stood before a display screen, showing data from sensors they had thought were long dead. Sarah was already there, along with the other senior colonists. Elder Zenthara represented the Altarian refugees, her tall form tense with fear that needed no translation. Show him, Hassan said quietly. The screen displayed a three-dimensional map of the local star system. Red dots moved through space in formation, following a pattern that no natural phenomenon could explain. Ships. Lots of them. How long until they reach us? Marcus asked. 18 hours, maybe 20 if they maintain current speed, replied Dr. Park, the colony's physicist. The signatures match Kethvar fleet patterns from the database. The room fell silent. For 30 years they had lived with the possibility of discovery. They had planned for it, prepared for it, dreaded it. Now it was happening. And somehow none of their preparations felt adequate. How many ships? Sarah asked. Hard to tell from this distance. At least 20, possibly more. It's a scout fleet, not a full invasion force, but still more than enough to... Dr. Park didn't finish the sentence. Everyone knew what Kethvar scout fleets did to inhabited worlds. Elder Zenthara spoke for the first time, her translated words carrying the weight of experience. They may not know we are here. Scout fleets investigate many systems. Perhaps they will scan and move on. And if they don't? Hassan asked. The Altarian's silence was answer enough. They spent the next 6 hours in desperate preparation. Emergency supplies were distributed to family bunkers. The fusion reactor was prepared for emergency shutdown. The colony's small cache of weapons was checked and distributed to those who knew how to use them. Not that weapons would matter much against a Kethvar fleet. Marcus found himself assigned to the communications team. Their plan was simple. If discovery was inevitable, they would attempt contact. Sarah had studied Kethvar language patterns from intercepted transmissions over the years. Perhaps they could negotiate, offer something the Hive wanted. Buy time for evacuation. It was a desperate hope. But hope was all they had. Lily Chen spent that day as she spent every other day, unaware that her world was about to end. She attended her classes in the morning, learning mathematics and basic engineering from Mr. Kim. She played with her friends during lunch, running through the gardens and climbing the old oak tree that had been planted by the first colonists. In the afternoon, she sat with Elder Zenthara and the other Altarian children, learning about their culture and history. The elder taught them songs in the Altarian language, beautiful harmonies that seemed to make the air itself shimmer. Lily had a gift for the music, her young voice blending perfectly with the complex alien melodies. Will you teach me the song about the crystal cities? Lily asked when the lesson ended. Elder Zenthara's eyes dimmed slightly. That song is for mourning, little one. It tells of beauty that can never return. But I want to understand. I want to know what your world was like. The elder looked at the human child for a long moment, seeing innocence that she had thought lost from the galaxy. Very well. But remember, some songs carry sadness as well as beauty. As evening came, the adults tried to maintain normal routines for the children's sake. Families gathered for dinner, though conversation was strained. Parents tucked their children into bed with extra hugs and lingering kisses. Sarah Chen told Lily her favorite story about brave explorers discovering new worlds, while Marcus checked and rechecked the locks on their windows. The Kethvar fleet arrived in system at Aero 347, local time. The colony's remaining sensors tracked their approach with growing dread. The ships moved with mechanical precision, spreading out to scan the system methodically. There was no hiding now. The energy signatures from the settlement's reactor and life support systems would be clearly visible to their advanced sensors. At 0600, the first Kethvar transmission reached the planet. It was not a greeting or a demand for surrender. It was a scan, deep and penetrating, that mapped every structure, every life sign, every piece of technology on the planet's surface. The aliens knew exactly what they had found. Sarah stood in the communication center, her throat dry as she prepared to make first contact with humanity's greatest enemy. The transmission equipment was old but functional. If she could just make them understand that the colony posed no threat, the response came at Yo632. Not words, but images transmitted directly to their screens. Burned worlds, empty cities, corpses floating in the void. The HFY were not interested in negotiation. At Yo700, the first landing craft launched from the fleet. Director Hassan activated the colony's emergency alert system. Sirens wailed across the settlement as families rushed to their assigned bunkers. The plan was for civilians to hide while a small team attempted to buy time through communication or, if necessary, resistance. Lily woke to the sound of sirens and her parents' urgent voices. "What's happening?" she asked, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Just a drill, sweetheart," Sarah lied, helping her daughter dress quickly. "We need to go to the special shelter, remember? Like we practiced." The special shelter was the colony's school, built with reinforced walls and deep foundations. It had been designed to protect the children from natural disasters, but everyone hoped it might offer some protection from what was coming. 60 children, human and Altarian, were gathered there with their teachers and caretakers. The HFY landing craft touched down at Do745. Marcus watched from the command center as the alien ships disgorged their cargo. The HFY soldiers were nothing like the graceful Altarians or the diverse forms of other species described in old databases. They moved like machines, all identical in their dark carapaces and weapon arrays. They showed no interest in the settlement's architecture or the beauty of the natural landscape. They simply began killing. The first targets were the outer farms, where early rising colonists were tending to morning chores. The HFY weapons made no sound, but the results were instantly visible on the surveillance screens. Humans simply ceased to exist, their molecular bonds dissolved by technology beyond comprehension. "We need to evacuate," Dr. Park urged. "There are caves in the northern hills. If some of us can escape—" "No," Hassan replied grimly. "They'll hunt down any survivors. We've seen how this goes." Sarah made one last attempt at communication, broadcasting on all frequencies in carefully constructed HFY language. "We surrender. We offer no resistance. Please, we have children here. Innocent children who have done nothing wrong." The response was immediate and clear. More landing craft descended from orbit. The HFY moved through the settlement with systematic efficiency. They swept through each building, each bunker, each hiding place. Their weapons worked silently, turning living beings into constituent atoms. They showed no emotion, no hesitation, no mercy. By 0830, they had reached the school. Lily huddled with her classmates in the shelter's main room, listening to the sounds outside. The other children were crying, but the Altarian younglings made no sound. They knew what was coming. Their species had learned fear in ways human children could not yet understand. Elder Zenthara stood guard at the shelter door, though her only weapon was an old hunting rifle that would be useless against HFY armor. When the aliens finally broke through, she faced them with dignity, speaking words of defiance in her native tongue. They killed her first. Then they moved methodically through the shelter, their weapons reducing children and teachers to empty space. They showed no distinction between human and Altarian, young and old, crying and silent. All life was the same to them. All life was expendable. Lily found herself pressed against the far wall with 3 other children, her best friend Tom, little Anna, who was only 5, and Catherine, an Altarian child who had taught her to sing. They held hands as the soldiers approached, too frightened to move or speak. The lead HFY soldier stopped before them, its multifaceted eyes recording their faces for species identification. It raised its weapon, pausing only to catalog 4 more examples of inferior life that served no purpose in the hegemony's grand design. Outside, Sarah and Marcus Chen watched through security feeds as their daughter faced death. They saw her small hand holding Catherine's larger one. They saw her trying to be brave even as tears ran down her face. They saw the moment when she looked directly into the camera, as if she knew her parents were watching. "I love you," Lily whispered to the screen, though she was too young to understand that her words were being recorded for transmission across the galaxy. The HFY soldier fired. 4 children became empty space, their atoms scattered. The transmission from Kepler 442b reached the hidden station. Prometheus 6, 14 minutes after the last human died. Captain Elena, Vasquez had been monitoring deep space frequencies for 27 years, waiting for a signal that might never come. Prometheus 6 was one of 47 listening posts scattered throughout the galaxy's outer rim, each one staffed by volunteers who had given up normal lives to watch and wait in the darkness between stars. Most days brought nothing but cosmic background radiation and the faint whispers of long-dead civilizations. Today brought the sound of children dying. Vasquez watched the transmission 3 times before her hand stopped shaking enough to operate her equipment. The images were crystal clear: the peaceful settlement, the desperate attempts at communication, the systematic murder of innocents. And at the center of it all, a small human girl holding an alien child's hand, while death approached them both. "You bastards," she whispered to the empty command center. "You absolute bastards." Prometheus 6 had been disguised as a dead comet for 3 decades, its fusion reactor running on minimal power, its crew of 12 maintaining absolute communication silence. That silence ended now. Vasquez activated quantum transmitters that had waited a generation for this moment, sending the Kepler 442b recordings to every hidden human outpost in the galaxy. The response was immediate and terrifying. On the rim world of Haven's Gate, 3 million humans who had lived as simple farmers and miners suddenly remembered who they really were. Hidden weapon caches were opened. Camouflaged shipyards came online. Children who had grown up believing their parents were refugees learned they were descendants of humanity's greatest military minds. Admiral Chen, "We received the transmission while inspecting the colony's newest agricultural expansion." She was 67 years old, officially retired from military service for 30 years. Unofficially, she had spent those decades preparing for this exact moment. The transmission from Kepler 442b was not just evidence of atrocity. It was the activation code she had been waiting for. "All units, this is Stormcrown." She broadcast on frequencies that had been silent since the Great Retreat. "Authorization Thunderchild 77. Begin Phase 1. Across the galaxy, humans who had spent decades disguised as merchants, refugees, and wanderers began to shed their false identities. The scattered fleet captains who had been running supplies to isolated colonies revealed their true cargo: weapons, troops, and military hardware beyond anything the galaxy suspected humanity possessed. Dr. James Morrison had been living on the trade station Crossroads for 15 years, working as a simple xenobiologist studying alien plant samples. His real expertise was in Kethvar biology and psychology. Within hours of receiving the transmission, he was analyzing the tactical data from Kepler 442b, mapping Kethvar fleet movements and communication patterns. The child in the transmission haunted him. Her name was Lily Chen, according to the settlement records included in the emergency broadcast. 8 years old. She had loved singing and gardening and alien stories. She had died holding a friend's hand while monsters watched. Morrison's analysis confirmed what humanity's hidden leadership already suspected. The Kethvar were not individuals but components of a vast collective intelligence. They felt no empathy, no remorse, no fear. They were perfect soldiers, perfectly soulless machines of destruction. But machines could be broken. The Altarian refugee ship Singing Stone had been traveling between human settlements for 20 years, carrying news and supplies to isolated communities. Captain Zarathul had lost her own children to the Kethvar decades ago. When she received the transmission from Kepler 442b, she wept for the first time since her homeworld died. They were just babies, she told her human passengers. The human child was singing Altarian songs. I heard her voice in the background recordings. She was trying to comfort our children even as death came for them all. The human passengers were not the refugees they appeared to be. They were intelligence operatives, diplomats, and military observers who had been making contact with surviving alien populations throughout the rim. The transmission from Kepler 442b changed everything. What had been a careful, gradual process of building trust now became an urgent mission of alliance. Within 48 hours, the Singing Stone was broadcasting the images of Lily Chen and Catherine to every alien settlement they could reach. The message was simple. Humanity had not forgotten their alien friends. The child who died had been protecting an Altarian child. Humans and aliens had faced death together. The response from alien survivors was immediate and emotional. Species that had been scattered and broken by Kethvar aggression suddenly had something they had lost decades ago: hope. On the factory ship New Byzantium, hidden in the Veil Nebula, 10,000 humans who had spent 30 years building weapons in secret received their activation orders. The ship itself was a disguise, appearing to sensors as nothing more than a derelict hulk drifting in the cosmic dust. In reality, it was one of humanity's greatest achievements, a fully automated weapons factory capable of equipping a fleet. Chief Engineer Sarah Kim had been born on New Byzantium, her entire life spent maintaining the machinery that would someday arm humanity's return to war. She had wondered if that day would ever come. Now, watching the transmission from Kepler 442b for the 100th time, she knew exactly why she had been born. The weapons emerging from New Byzantium's production lines were unlike anything the galaxy had seen. Human military technology had not stagnated during the long hiding. Instead, it had evolved in secret, guided by the most brilliant minds of a species that had always excelled at finding new ways to kill their enemies. Plasma weapons that could burn through Kethvar armor. Kinetic projectiles that moved at near light speed. Most importantly, quantum resonance warheads that could disrupt the neural connections that linked individual Kethvar to their collective consciousness. Dr. Morrison's research had shown that the Kethvar hive was vulnerable to precisely the kind of psychological warfare that humans had perfected. Individual Kethvar cut off from the collective became confused, frightened, and vulnerable. They could be made to feel emotions they had never experienced: doubt, terror, despair. Humanity was about to teach them what those emotions meant. The first strike came 72 hours after Lily Chen died. The Kethvar scout fleet that had destroyed Kepler 442b was finishing its resource extraction when space around them simply exploded. Ships that appeared on no sensors materialized from quantum stealth fields, their weapons already firing. The attack was so sudden and brutal that the Kethvar fleet had no time to send a distress signal. Within minutes, 12 Kethvar vessels were reduced to expanding clouds of plasma and debris. The attackers vanished as quickly as they had appeared, leaving only emptiness and the fading echoes of directed energy weapons. The attack force was led by Captain Maria Santos, commanding the stealth destroyer Righteous Fury. Her ship had been built in secret over 15 years, incorporating technology that made it invisible to every known sensor system. Her crew of 40 were all volunteers who had lost family to Kethvar raids. First blood to Lily Chen, Santos announced to her crew as they prepared to jump to their next target. Let's see how the hive likes being hunted. Similar attacks began occurring throughout Kethvar space. Individual ships and small squadrons simply disappeared, destroyed so quickly they could not transmit warning or tactical data. The hive's intelligence network began developing gaps, dead zones where their forces vanished without explanation. The psychological effect on the collective consciousness was exactly what Dr. Morrison had predicted. The Kethvar were accustomed to being predators, not prey. The sudden appearance of an unknown enemy that struck without warning and left no survivors began to create something the hive had never experienced: uncertainty. Admiral Vasquez, now revealed as the supreme commander of humanity's hidden fleets, watched the tactical reports from her flagship, the dreadnought Defiant Hope. The ship had been disguised as a mining vessel for 25 years, its true nature hidden beneath layers of false sensor signatures and cargo containers. The bridge crew was composed entirely of officers who had served with distinction during humanity's retreat from the inner galaxy. They had spent decades planning for this moment, studying Kethvar tactics, preparing countermeasures for every possible scenario. Now their patience was bearing fruit. Status report, Vasquez ordered. 37 confirmed kills in the first wave, reported her tactical officer. No human casualties. The enemy is beginning to alter patrol patterns, but they're still following predictable algorithms. And the alien response? Better than expected. The Altarian survivors have provided detailed intelligence on Kethvar weak points. The Velkin resistant cells are emerging from hiding. Even some species we thought extinct are making contact. Vasquez nodded grimly. The image of Lily Chen holding hands with an alien child had done more to unite the galaxy's survivors than 30 years of careful diplomacy. Sometimes the most powerful weapons were not made of metal and energy, but of love and sacrifice and the refusal to let evil go unanswered. The Kethvar overmind, the vast collective intelligence that see. The Kethvar hive queen Vexithara had been alive for over 2,000 years, her consciousness linked to billions of drones across hundreds of worlds. She had witnessed the conquest of galaxies, the extinction of countless species, and the perfect order that came with absolute dominance. She had never experienced doubt, until now. The reports flooding into the Overmind made no sense, entire fleets simply vanishing, outposts found empty, their defenders atomized by weapons that left no trace, supply convoys disappearing between jump points, their cargo ships discovered weeks later, as expanding clouds of debris, and through it all, no enemy contact, no communication, no demands for surrender, just death, silent and sudden and absolute. Analysis. She commanded the tactical nodes of the collective consciousness. The response came as a flood of data and hypothesis, filtered through millions of drone minds working in perfect synchronization. Unknown enemy force, advanced stealth technology. Precision targeting suggests detailed intelligence. Attack patterns indicate coordinated command structure. Conclusion: new threat detected. But the data told her nothing about who they were or what they wanted. The enemy left no survivors, took no prisoners, issued no ultimatums. They simply killed with a methodical precision that would have impressed the hive if it were not so terrifying. For the first time in her existence, Vexithara ordered defensive measures. Captain Maria Santos watched the Kethvar heavy cruiser through her ship's quantum sensors, studying its movement patterns and escort formations. The vessel carried a full battalion of Kethvar soldiers and enough firepower to sterilize a planet. It was also the flagship of Sub-Commander Grixthul, the hive officer who had personally overseen the massacre at Kepler 442b. Target confirmed, she reported to her crew. This is the bastard who killed the children. The righteous fury had been hunting Grixthul for 6 weeks, tracking him through a dozen star systems as he carried out routine patrol duties. Human intelligence networks had provided detailed information about his schedule, his escort patterns, and his psychological profile. The hunt was about to end. All stations ready, reported her weapons officer. Quantum resonance warheads armed and targeted. Remember, Santos told her crew, we want him alive. The others can die, but Grixthul answers for what he did to Lily Chen. The attack began at 0347 ship time. The righteous fury dropped out of quantum stealth directly above the Kethvar formation, its weapons already firing. The escort vessels died in the first salvo, their shields overwhelmed by concentrated plasma fire. The heavy cruiser found itself alone and defenseless in the space between stars. But instead of destroying it, the human ship simply waited. Grixthul had never experienced isolation from the hive mind. When the quantum resonance pulse severed his neural link to the collective consciousness, the sensation was indescribable. Suddenly he was alone in his own thoughts, cut off from the certainty and purpose that had defined his existence. For the first time he was truly individual, and individuality, for a creature raised in the collective, was terrifying. Unknown vessel, he transmitted, his voice carrying undertones his species had never produced before. Uncertainty, fear, desperation. Why do you attack us? What do you want? The response came as an image transmitted directly to his ship's communication system. A small human child holding hands with an Altarian youngling, both facing death with more courage than a Kethvar warrior could comprehend. Beneath the image were words in perfect Kethvar language. You killed our children. Now you answer for it. I do not understand, Grixthul replied, his certainty crumbling as individual thought patterns his brain had never developed began firing randomly. I follow the hive's commands. I serve the Overmind's will. I am not responsible for individual actions. Another image appeared, surveillance footage from Kepler 442b, showing Grixthul personally entering the school shelter, personally raising his weapon, personally firing the shot that ended 4 young lives. The timestamp was clearly visible along with biometric identification that proved his identity beyond doubt. That was you, came the reply. You looked at children who posed no threat and chose murder over mercy. You are responsible. For the first time in his existence, Grixthul felt something the hive had never taught him to understand. Guilt. The emotion hit him like a physical blow, sending unfamiliar chemicals flooding through his nervous system. His multifaceted eyes focused on the image of the human child, seeing her face not as a tactical target, but as a living being whose existence he had ended. They were. He struggled with concepts his mind had never been designed to process. The hive commands nothing now, came the cold response. You are alone. You are individual. You are responsible for your choices. And you chose to murder children. The psychological torture continued for 7 hours. The human ship kept Grixthel's vessel trapped while flooding his communications with images from Kepler 442b. Children playing in gardens, families sharing meals, humans and Altarians living together in peace. And then the final moments, the systematic slaughter, the casual brutality inflicted on innocence itself. Grixthul experienced each death from a perspective his collective consciousness had never allowed, as an individual capable of choice, seeing the moral weight of his actions without the comforting certainty of hive purpose. The guilt and horror nearly drove him insane. When the humans finally destroyed his ship, it was almost a mercy. But the real purpose of the hunt was not execution, it was information. Dr. James Morrison analyzed the transmissions from Grixthel's interrogation with growing excitement. For the first time, humanity had clear evidence of how individual Kethvar responded to psychological isolation. The results exceeded his most optimistic projections. They're completely dependent on the collective, he reported to Admiral Vasquez. Cut one off from the hive mind and their entire psychological framework collapses. They become capable of guilt, fear, regret, despair, all the emotions they've never had to deal with. Can we weaponize it? Vasquez asked. We already are. The quantum resonance technology can be scaled up. Instead of cutting off individual soldiers, we can sever entire fleets from the overmind. Imagine 1,000 Kethvar warriors suddenly experiencing individual consciousness for the first time, all the guilt and horror of their actions hitting them at once. The implications were staggering. Humanity had found a weapon that could turn the Kethvar's greatest strength, their collective consciousness, into their greatest weakness. But first, they needed to test it on a larger scale. The Kethvar fortress world of Gethmor had been built in the ruins of what was once the Altarian capital. The planet's crystal cities had been ground to dust, its singing forests burned to ash, its people enslaved and worked to death in the construction of hive military installations. Now it served as a staging ground for continued expansion into the outer rim. 3 million Kethvar soldiers were stationed on Gethmor, along with the infrastructure to support major fleet operations. The fortress was considered impregnable, protected by orbital defense platforms and energy shields that could repel any conventional attack. Humanity didn't plan a conventional attack. Operation Lilies. Vengeance began at 000 Standard Galactic Time, 6 months after the massacre at Kepler 442b. 50 human ships dropped out of quantum stealth in perfect synchronization around Gethmor, their positions calculated to create a resonance field that encompassed the entire planet. The quantum pulse that followed was the most powerful weapon humanity had ever deployed. In an instant, every Kethvar on the planet was cut off from the overmind, their collective consciousness severed, their individual minds suddenly forced to confront the reality of their existence. The effect was devastating. 3 million creatures who had never experienced doubt suddenly doubted everything. Warriors who had committed genocide without question suddenly saw their victims as individuals. Soldiers who had followed orders without conscience suddenly understood the moral weight of their actions. The screaming could be heard from orbit. Some Kethvar simply collapsed, their minds unable to process the sudden influx of guilt and horror. Others turned their weapons on themselves, seeking escape from emotions they had never been designed to feel. A few went completely insane, attacking anything that moved in desperate attempts to silence the voices of conscience they had never possessed. Within hours, the fortress world of Gethmor had become a charnel house of madness and self-destruction. The few survivors huddled in bunkers, paralyzed by terror and regret, no longer capable of functioning as soldiers. Admiral Vasquez watched the aftermath from her flagship, feeling no satisfaction in the victory. The sight of 3 million beings destroying themselves was horrific, even when those beings had committed atrocities beyond counting. But justice was not always pleasant, and some crimes demanded answers that could only be paid in blood. "Send the message," she ordered. The transmission went out on all frequencies, broadcasting to every Kethvar installation in the galaxy. The message was simple and clear, delivered in perfect hive language. "This is humanity. You killed our children. We are coming for you. Surrender now, or face the same fate as Gethmore. The response from the Kethvar Overmind came 12 hours later. Unknown species, you commit atrocities against the natural order. Individual consciousness. The Kethvar Overmind had ruled for 3,000 years through perfect unity of purpose. Every drone thought the same thoughts, felt the same certainties, followed the same unquestionable logic of expansion and consumption. The collective consciousness was absolute, eternal, and utterly confident in its superiority over the chaotic individualism of lesser species. That confidence died with the fall of Gethmore. For the first time in its existence, the Overmind experienced uncertainty. The loss of 3 million drones was not strategically significant. The Hive had absorbed such casualties before. But the manner of their loss, the psychological weapon that had turned collective strength into individual weakness, represented something the Overmind had never encountered, an enemy that understood them better than they understood themselves. Analysis complete, reported the tactical nodes. Enemy capability assessment, total psychological warfare dominance. Recommendation, immediate negotiation. The word negotiation had not appeared in Hive communications for over 1,000 years. It was a concept from the early days of expansion, when the Kethvar still encountered species capable of meaningful resistance. But those days were long past, buried beneath the certainty of absolute victory. Until now. Admiral Elena Vasquez stood on the bridge of her flagship as humanity's greatest fleet assembled in the darkness between stars. 200 ships that had been hidden across the galaxy for 30 years now revealed their true nature. What had appeared to be cargo haulers, research vessels, and colony ships shed their disguises to become dreadnoughts, carriers, and assault cruisers armed with weapons the galaxy had never seen. The fleet was named in honor of a little girl who had loved alien songs and died protecting a friend. They called it Lily's Justice. Status report, Vasquez ordered. All ships report ready for final assault, her tactical officer replied. The quantum resonance generators are online and synchronized. Alien resistance cells have confirmed their positions. We're ready to end this. But Vasquez hesitated. The plan was simple. A coordinated strike on every major Hive world simultaneously, using quantum resonance weapons to sever the collective consciousness permanently. The psychological shock would destroy the Kethvar as a functioning civilization, leaving them scattered and broken across the galaxy. It would be genocide. Justifiable genocide, perhaps, given what the Kethvar had done to hundreds of other species. But genocide nonetheless. The decision was taken out of her hands when the Hive sent their message. Unknown species designated humanity, came the transmission from the Overmind itself. Your actions threaten the natural order. The collective consciousness is efficient. Individual thought is chaos. We offer terms for your surrender. Vasquez almost laughed. After 30 years of hiding, 6 months of systematic hunting and the complete humiliation of their fortress world, the Hive was offering terms for humanity's surrender. Let me guess, she replied. We give up our weapons, submit to collective consciousness, and live as drones in your perfect society? Correct. The offer is generous. Individual consciousness causes suffering. The collective provides purpose. You will be happier as part of the Hive. The Admiral looked around her bridge at officers who had spent decades preparing for this moment. She thought of the hidden colonies where human children had grown up believing their parents were simple farmers and miners. She thought of alien refugees who had waited decades for justice. Most of all, she thought of a little girl holding hands with an alien child, facing death with more courage than any Hive drone could comprehend. Counteroffer, Vasquez said. You had the entire galaxy to conquer. You could have killed 1 billion adults, enslaved whole worlds, and we might have eventually found a way to coexist. But you looked innocent children in the eyes and chose cruelty over mercy. You made it personal. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. There will be no negotiation. There will be no surrender. There will be no mercy. You are going to pay for every child you murdered, every family you destroyed, every species you drove extinct. And you are going to pay with your existence. The response from the Overmind carried something that had never appeared in Hive communications before. Desperation. Your emotional responses are inefficient. Revenge serves no logical purpose. The children you reference were irrelevant biological units consuming resources. Their termination was optimal. Irrelevant biological units? Vasquez felt the cold fury that had sustained her for 30 years crystallize into something harder than diamond. Their names were Lily Chen and Catherine and Tom Morrison and Anna Park. They were 8 years old and 6 years old and 9 years old and 5 years old. They liked to sing songs and grow flowers and play games. They were not biological units. They were children, and you murdered them. The final assault began 18 hours later. Operation Righteous Dawn was the largest military action in galactic history, involving not just humanity's hidden fleets but resistance cells from dozens of supposedly extinct species. The Altarian survivors emerged from hiding with crystal ships that sang death songs. The Velkan resistance activated sleeper agents embedded in hive installations for decades. Even species that had been considered primitive and harmless revealed hidden military capabilities that caught the Kethvar completely off guard. But the real weapon was not ships or energy, weapons or exotic technology. It was something the collective consciousness had never learned to fight. The power of individual choice driven by love and sacrifice and the refusal to let evil go, unanswered. The quantum resonance pulse that followed encompassed half the galaxy. In an instant, the overmind was shattered. Billions of Kethvar drones suddenly found themselves alone in their own thoughts, forced to confront the reality of their actions without the comforting certainty of collective purpose. The psychological shock was devastating and absolute. On the capital world of Keth Prime, 1 billion warriors who had committed genocide across the galaxy suddenly understood what they had done. The weight of their crimes, suppressed for millennia by collective consciousness, hit them all at once. Some went insane. Others simply collapsed. A few turned their weapons on themselves, seeking escape from guilt they had never been designed to feel. But some did something unprecedented in Kethvar history. They chose differently. Sub-Commander. Nexthara had been part of the fleet that destroyed the Altarian homeworld. As the quantum pulse severed her connection to the Overmind, she suddenly saw that action not as efficient resource allocation, but as the murder of billions of innocent beings. The crystal cities she had helped destroy appeared in her memory not as inefficient structures but as beautiful works of art, created by people who had loved and dreamed and hoped. For the first time in her existence, she felt remorse. Around her, the hive's command structure collapsed as individual Kethvar struggled with emotions they had never experienced. Some fought against the chaos, trying to restore collective order through force. Others simply fled, unable to cope with the sudden burden of individual consciousness. But a few, like Nexthara, made a different choice. They chose to face their guilt, to accept responsibility for their actions, to try to find some way to atone for crimes that could never be forgiven. The war ended not with a final battle but with surrender. The few remaining hive fleets, cut off from the Overmind and no longer capable of coordinated action, simply stopped fighting. Individual Kethvar commanders, overwhelmed by guilt and horror at their own actions, began broadcasting messages of capitulation. "We surrender," came transmission after transmission. "We cannot fight anymore. We cannot bear what we have done. Please, make it stop." Admiral Vasquez received the final surrender aboard her flagship as humanity's fleets completed their sweep of former hive space. The galaxy's greatest empire had fallen not to superior firepower, but to the simple realization that their victims had been real people, with real lives and real dreams. The cleanup took months. Humanity and its alien allies worked together to provide aid to surviving Kethvar, many of whom had been driven to the edge of madness by their sudden acquisition of conscience. It was strange to see former genocidal warriors reduced to trembling creatures, begging forgiveness for crimes they finally understood. Some Kethvar chose suicide rather than live with their guilt. Others retreated to remote worlds, seeking isolation from the species they had wronged. But a surprising number chose to stay and help with reconstruction efforts, working to rebuild what they had destroyed, even though they knew forgiveness was impossible. The memorial was built on the world that had been Kepler 442b, where a peaceful colony had once raised children in gardens beneath alien stars. The monument was simple. 2 statues, one of a human child and one of an Altarian youngling, their hands joined in eternal friendship. Beneath them were inscribed the names of every being who had died in the colony, along with a message in every known language. In memory of the children whose death reminded the galaxy that some lines should never be crossed. They died holding hands across the space between species, showing us that love transcends all boundaries. May their sacrifice ensure that innocence is never again answered.